So this one is based on an absolutely fascinating and riveting true story. And the adaptation is written and directed by Tiller Russell, who based it on an article by David Kushner. However, I was familiar with this story from before because I'd read a book called American Kingpin, which by the way is phenomenal and I would wholeheartedly recommend it if you're interested in this story. So I wasn't personally expecting to see a lot of surprises or be blown away by this. But I was still very much interested in seeing this story play out on screen. Because as I said, it's just a great story and reading about it is one thing, but I feel like seeing it play out in a movie is a different experience entirely. Now, what is the story even about? Well, as the title might suggest, it's about Silk Road, a website where one could buy drugs or basically anything illegal, but it worked just like eBay or Amazon. And long story short, it worked because you had to access it through an encrypted browser and you paid with Bitcoin. And the story here follows two characters, the first one being the creator of that website, Ross Ulbricht, and the second one being the DEA officer who's on the case, trying to track him down. And you know, it's a pretty straightforward narrative that shouldn't really confuse anyone. It's easy to follow and it just gets to the gist of the story and doesn't meander or get sidetracked too much. However, I would say that this did feel a bit rushed and it didn't really dive very deeply into any particular part of the story. Instead, it just gives you a general overview of what happened here. It basically felt like a Cliff Notes version of the story, at least to me it did. And I guess that's where my particular point of view comes in, because as I said, I read a whole book about this already. So this didn't really add any new depth to the story, but if you haven't read anything about it, then you might even be blown away by some of the twists and turns, because it does get pretty nutty. I mean, this story is just bonkers and takes you on a wild ride with some really crazy things happening. And this movie does get into some of that stuff too, but again, it's just scraping the surface. It's unfortunately also forced to constantly stop to explain a lot of the stuff through dialogue, which didn't feel very smooth, but I guess it's necessary for people who just don't know anything about this subject. But I feel like the biggest issue was that it just didn't focus on any one particular thing enough. I think this would have worked better had it been focused on either Ross or the DEA agent. And it does feel like it actually put a lot more focus on the cop than Ross. Because Ross as part of the story felt really thin and underdeveloped. Well, the cop's story did at least feel like there was some effort put into it. And I think that character might have been fictional as well, so all of that might have just been made up, and it did feel too contrived at times as well. But at least it gave the guy some motivation and a bit of something to drive his pursuit. Ross, on the other hand, felt a bit like an empty shell, and especially the relationship with his girlfriend just felt shallow. And from what I can recall, that relationship was an important part of this story, actually. But here it doesn't really even make sense because they just put no time and effort into building that relationship. And because of his behavior, it made zero sense for her to stick around. Exactly because we just get these very brief interactions between the two. Now, when it comes to the more technical side of things, I would say that this movie is fine. Not much more, but it's fine, it works, there's nothing horribly wrong with it. And if you're not familiar with this story in detail from before, I would imagine it could be rather entertaining. But if you are, this just isn't really gonna blow you away or anything. I mean, I thought it was still fine. It was okay, but not really anything special at all. And as a result, I can't really give this much more than a low 6. Boop. But if you aren't familiar with this story from before, I would still probably recommend it. So, you know, maybe check it out or maybe don't. After all, I'm not your dad. But hey, what are your thoughts on this? Have you seen it? Did you like it? Let me know. And if you enjoyed the video, maybe give it a thumbs up or sub to the channel because that would be fantastic.